Once again, welcome to ITSE 1345. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Functions. Before we get too deep into this process, functions are a little different in that what I've talked about so far is where you get information and you bring it into the structure that you're going to be working with. And everything we've dealt with has revolved around the fact that you're doing everything external to the database. So everything you're doing is happening outside, and then when you get through with it, you put it back. Well, we're still going to follow the standard create or replace function name, and the structure that's generic to all these processes. But what is unique about a function is that when you create the function, it is actually warehoused inside the database itself. It's not really external to the operations, it's internal to the operation. Because everything we've been doing so far has been external to that process. We export it and you work on it. Because when you create the function, it resides inside the actual database. And that is similar to how if you do the SQL without the PL SQL. So I want to talk about working with SQL and not using PL SQL. So if you just use SQL, you can do sum. So there's some math functions that you can do in SQL. Now the sum is a function that will add numbers. So, but the sum is a function that will add numbers that's warehoused in the database and not really external. So when you create a function in PL SQL, it is warehoused internally and it becomes part of the inventory of those programs that you can call to do calculations. That said, it has a little bit more maintenance that you have to do. You have to be a little bit more careful with it because it can also be used external to the processes and not just external like everything we've been talking about. So we're going to say that the function is a calculator. It performs a task. Now the task, I told you once again, you can do comparative items where it's equal to, not equal to. You can use letters, numbers, dates. You can use string comparisons. So there's a lot of things you can do with it. Now, the function is always part of an expression that you're going to be doing. So it is that testing, calculating element in a sequence of structures and events that you're going to be doing. So once again, we will begin with the create or replace. And then you'll have the function and function name. At this point, I want to take a minute and talk about the naming convention. We really haven't talked about the naming convention so far. In all these items where you create or replace, you're creating or replacing a program, a subprogram. And the convention has been that when you create something, you give it an identifier that will reflect the action that it's going to be taking. Now, the reason you do that is twofold. One, it helps to keep track of everything that's happening. Also, if an error occurs, the name of that program will help you identify where the problem is, because if you're not really specific or too generic on that name and an error occurs, you can have a hard time figuring out where the problem is because the name is not specific enough to help you identify it. So understand that the naming convention, as you develop this, should be part of the process you're doing. So once again, way back when we talked about the FICA and the insurance and the benefits calculations. So in that number, you should have like FICA calculations. So when you do this thing and you have FICA and something crashes, you know that it's associated with that activity. So the naming convention is critical in this whole process that we're talking about, whether it's packages, cursors, functions, or anything else that you have to create. The naming convention is critical. There's also something unique where a function can be used within SQL, a procedure cannot, and a package cannot. And that's because that function is part of that internal mechanism where it's embedded in the inventory of all the programs that SQL can run. Now, once again, you have the standard, when you create or replace a function, you have to identify the parameters that you're going to use. Okay, so you have to identify the parameters. As you identify the parameter, the other distinction about a function is that you're going to have a value return. So you're going to have something that's going to return. And the return is going to be some value that you're going to use. So a calculator is embedded in some process. It does some calculation, and it's going to give you a value back. So it's going to give you a value back. What are you going to do with this? Remember way back when we talked about the in and out, when you bring something in and you do the calculations, are you going to return the same value or a different value? Well, I mean, it is evident that if you have a calculation and you have an outcome, that outcome is the result of some action, but it's not going to be closely related to whatever you work with. So you have to establish a process that will take that output and do something with it. So you have to define a process that tells the function and the return value what you're going to do with it. Now, the other thing is that as you're doing this, there's what they call actual and formal. Now, what these are placeholders. Now, sometimes when you're working with data, you really don't want to work with the actual data because if you screw it up, you can really create problems. You kind of want to clone it or give it another value. So you're actually saving the actual data, and then you're using some representative of that data to do whatever you want to work. And it goes back to that issue where you had the very beginning, the example where we had the $10 and the 40 hours. Well, if you bring the 40 hours in, the question is, do you really want to use the 40 hours? Because, I mean, that is really significant data that you don't want to screw up. So what you want to do is maybe give that 40 hours another value that will actually be used in the process, so that way you're protecting that 40 hours and not really doing anything that could damage that, because that is very critical data. So there's this process where you can use actual data or formal data, and that kind of helps the thing that's happening. Now, the other thing is that when you have, when you do a select from where, and you have select field 1, field 2, field 3, field 4, as you're bringing this stuff in, there is a mechanism that allows you to pass values from one area to another area. So you would create a sequence of placeholders, and then you would pass the information from that process into those placeholders to you to work. Now, the other interesting thing about a function is that it can have multiple outputs. It is one of the few events where you can actually use an if, then. So what you do is you say, remember we talked about the retirement process where you had 0 to 5, 5 to 7, and 7 to 10 for the retirement. So in this function, you can do comparative analysis where you can do if 0 to 5, you do this, if, and that way you can use the calculator testing to give you the correct output that you want. Because this is one of those SQL events that can actually play with the tables, as you're creating this, you also have to develop what they call purity levels. What you're telling the process somewhere along the way, you have to give it instructions that as you're going through this, you do or do not want this process to be able to write to the table. Or you do or do not want this process to read information from the table. And this is one of those things because you want to be sure that the instructions that you're given to this function, because if you're going to do the retirement, at what point do you want to take this information and work with it? So you have to kind of be sensitive to the fact that as you're doing this, you want to make sure that you don't allow a function to take an action that can be detrimental to the process, because it can read and can write to stuff. So you want to make sure that you give it the instructions on what you want it to do. In the purity levels, there are 4 events. The reason there are 4 events is that the function can be used in a localized event, or more of a global event, like a package. So when you're doing with this, you have to tell the function whether it's working within a limited constraint. So you have different instructions to the function when it is embedded in a limited event, or instructions to the function when it's embedded in a larger event like a package. So that about sums up the idea of the function.